It's January 14th, 2018, and this is your scripture reading and devotional for today. Your scripture reading today is from Genesis chapter 26, verse 1 through chapter 27, verse 29, Matthew chapter 17, verse 1 through chapter 18, verse 14, Psalm 9, verses 1 through 5, Proverbs 1, 32 to 33. And this is the text for Sunday, and so both of the lessons today at the Northside congregation will be coming from this text. Sunday morning will be what they saw on the mountain, Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 8, and Sunday evening or afternoon at 4 p.m., the lesson will be from that same chapter in verses 14 to 21, a faithless and perverse generation. The text I want to look at with you today is from Matthew chapter 18, verses 2 through 5, where Jesus uses a little child as a lesson illustration to teach his disciples something very important about the kind of people they're supposed to be. It says there, beginning in verse 2, "Then Jesus called a little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, Assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me." Of course, we know the question that precipitated the response that Jesus is giving there is when the disciples came asking Jesus, who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And so Jesus uses a little child as an illustration for his answer to that question. And he puts the child out in front of them and says, if you want to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, you have to become like this little child. Well, what is it about a little child that Jesus was putting out in front of them for them to understand, for them to learn about what true greatness is? Greatness in the eyes of God, greatness that is spiritually beneficial. Well, it's not the kind of greatness that the world seeks after with stature and money and position and all of these things that the world seeks after, wanting to elevate themselves over others. And people in the world generally think of the great as those who have a lot of people serving them. Jesus flips that around and says, not just here, but in several places, that true greatness is not the one who has a lot of servants, but the one who serves a lot of people. Well, in this example of using the little child, he's pointing out a child as one who isn't really concerned about their stature. You know, you look at a little child, and a little child is not very concerned, doesn't put a whole lot of emphasis or spend a lot of time thinking about even their position in a hierarchy, whether or not they are somebody great or not. Little children just don't think that way. Little children typically aren't concerned about their place in the family. They don't challenge the authority of their parents. That typically comes later in the teenage years when they start challenging their parents' authority. But Jesus using a little child is an example of somebody who doesn't challenge authority and doesn't strive for a position of greatness, but rather a little child is humble. As it says in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5 through 6, likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. Be clothed with humility. That is that humble characteristic of a Christian. That is that childlike humility that Jesus is pointing out is supposed to be something that clothes us, just like the garments we put on. It's what people are supposed to see about us. He says, be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you in due time. See the difference there? That little child is not looking for self-exaltation. And so Jesus uses the child as an illustration of somebody who is humble, not worried about their stature or their position, just content to rely on their parents. Children are reliant on others for their care, just as he said in the parables in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 3, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." You know, that little child is an example of what Jesus was talking about by poor in spirit, because somebody who is poor in spirit doesn't rely on their own strength, on their own position, their own stature for what's truly important. They rely on God. Their reliance is on God. That's why we have those exhortations to be careful about riches, because if we start trusting in those riches, then our trust isn't in God. Our trust is in our own means. And our trust is always supposed to be in God. That's another characteristic that Jesus wants us to get from a little child, is that children are trusting. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 17, "Command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God who gives us richly all things to enjoy." So just like a little child is trusting in others to provide for them, to care for them, we're supposed to be trusting in God, not in the worldly treasures or the worldly riches that we might acquire, but our trust is in God. And another thing about children that we can learn from, that we can emulate, that childlike characteristic that helps us to be faithful people, is that children are innocent. Children are typically not malicious, not in a healthy situation, not unless there's something wrong. Children are not malicious or conniving or purposely trying to harm others. Not a small child. And that's what the Apostle Paul says about the kind of people we're supposed to be. In Romans chapter 16 and verse 19, he says, "For your obedience has become known to all," talking about the Roman church. "For your obedience has become known to all, therefore I am glad on your behalf. But I want you to be wise in what is good and simple," that is naive or innocent, "simple concerning evil." That is, we don't connive evil things. We're ignorant of evil. We're innocent of evil. We don't think about evil things. And a little child has that childlike innocence. That's the way we're supposed to be toward evil. So that's some of the characteristics of children that we can get from Jesus using this illustration of a little child to make this lesson to his disciples, not to worry about who's the greatest in the kingdom. Just be faithful. Trust in God like a little child trusts in their parents. Rely on God for your care like a little child relies on their parents for their care. Be innocent like a little child. And you won't spend a lot of time worrying about your stature or who's the greatest or who's not the greatest, whether somebody else is greater than you or you're greater than somebody else. You're not going to spend a lot of time thinking about that if you're thinking like a little child when it comes to your faithfulness, your reliance, your trust in God. Thanks for watching, and remember, we always love to hear from you. We'd love for you to leave some comments, some feedback in the comment section below.